Morning guys, it's about 20 to 6 in the morning. That was what I came for, this morning sunrise. So it's a bit noisy here because of the morning traffic heading between Napier and Hastings. So let's get on the track and go down to the outfall and see if we can't find somewhere quiet to talk. Just in case the welcome message that I recorded early this morning when it was still dark didn't come out. I'm going to do it again now. It's probably about, let's check. It's 8 minutes past 7 on the 9th of November 2016. And we're at the outfall at the Ahuriri estuary near where I live. And this podcast, as I promised, is going to be about the early history of the Hermetic tradition. And this is really a 101 for people who haven't been exposed to these kind of ideas at all. And I just want to cover this early history before I start dealing with things like the definition of alchemy, alchemy's relation to the concept of Hermetism, and then start getting into the serious stuff. So history first, so that we have some background and know where the Western Hermetic tradition came from and how those roots influenced the condition of the Hermetic tradition as we know it today. I think this is very important, and a lot of people don't study this information, and then they start getting confused and going down side alleys of information and everything which are not related at all, and wasting a lot of time and getting lost. So for us in Western culture, the Hermetic tradition has its furthest roots in legend, not in recorded history. It's certainly not in recorded history that is accepted by conventional historians. The ancient Egyptians are said to have been the source of the Hermetic tradition, but that's kind of questionable because that's based on the idea that the oldest records that the Egyptians have of the roots of the Hermetic tradition we assume that they're talking about their own culture when they're discussing those roots, but it is very likely that they're not discussing their own culture at all. Because this history, this legendary history, or this esoteric history, begins in around 30,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. In a temple in Egypt, there's a list called the King List, which is basically like a bullet point list of all the kings in Egypt that reigned back to the very first king. And that list tells us that the first kings of Egypt were gods, and that those gods had extremely long lifespans. And the guy that we're interested in, the god that we're interested in, the ancient Egyptians called him Djouti. And that name got kind of transmorphed into the word Thoth or Tot. And he is said to have begun his reign 30,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. So that means that if this lineage is true, Thoth reigned somewhere, possibly in the area of ancient Egypt, around 30,000 years ago, and that means before the end of the last ice age. The last ice age ended more or less 11,000 years ago. So that culture that he would have been involved in would have been a pre-ice age culture. But as I say, it's pretty much accepted that these lineages of the gods are to be primarily taken as legendary. The next part of the Hermetic tradition which is significant is the finding of the emerald tablet of Hermes. Hermes is the Greek name for the Egyptian god Thoth. When the Greeks conquered Egypt, Alexander the Great, I think it was, I'm not sure, but I think it was about 300 and something years before the beginning of the Christian era, the Greeks adopted a lot of Egyptian knowledge and nomenclature and concepts, and they converted the Egyptian gods into their own version of those gods. And Hermes, the god Hermes, was the Greeks' version of the god Thoth. It was said that there was an individual who went by the Greek title of Hermes Trismegistus, which means the thrice great Hermes. And there's a lot of confusion about who this individual was, because it seems really clear from explanations about ideas concerning this individual that Hermes Trismegistus was not the original Thoth of ancient Egypt, or the original god Hermes. That it's likely that a priestcraft was established around the cult of Thoth, or the cult of Hermes, and that it's likely that the high priest of that priestcraft took on the title Hermes Trismegistus. So it is possible that a number of individuals were referred to by that title over the period of history. History tells us, legendary history tells us, that this individual, Hermes Trismegistus, made an emerald tablet, and alchemists consider that this emerald tablet was made using a special alchemical process which allowed the alchemist Hermes Trismegistus to dissolve emeralds, the gemstones, and then to cast them in a mold, which then made a tablet, and that tablet had inscribed on it a number of verses. Legend also tells us that it was either Alexander the Great before the beginning of the Christian era, or a guy called Apollonius of Tyana in the early centuries of the Christian era, who found the tomb of Thoth, or rather of Hermes Trismegistus, and in his tomb in Egypt was found his remains sitting on a throne, and he was holding in his hands two books. One of those was the Emerald Tablet, and the other one was a book called the Book of Causes, which we almost never hear about in the modern Hermetic tradition. It's very unusual that we hear a lot about the Emerald Tablet, but we never hear the other part of the legend, which says that there is a book found with the corpse of Hermes Trismegistus called the Book of Causes. And you can find information about that if you Google it online. So it was either Alexander the Great that found this tomb and found the Emerald Tablet, or it was a man by the name, a famous mystic or magician by the name of Apollonius of Tyana. The Arabs believed that it was Apollonius who found this tomb and found the Emerald Tablet. In the legend connected with Alexander the Great, it says that when he found the tablet, that he actually took it to one of the cities in Egypt. I think it might have been Hermopolis, and put the tablet on public display in one of the temples there. Either way, by 200 AD, we have a lot of individuals in Egypt, in Alexandria, where a lot of different cultures had come together: the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians, and other cultures, to exchange and discuss intellectual knowledge and philosophy, and remembering that, of course, around that period we had the great library of Alexander, which attracted all these individuals. And one of the things that they were up to at this time was that they were discussing the Emerald Tablet, and they were considering different versions that were recorded of what was written on that tablet, and a number of different versions of that, of the writing on that tablet, or the meaning of the verses on that tablet, were circulating in Alexandria during that early period of Christianity. So that was the next stage, important stage in the development of the Western tradition. We could say today that besides the very distant legends about Hermetism, that the Emerald Tablet is the first solid thing that Western Hermetists can lay their hands on, which describes not only the core philosophy of the Hermetic tradition, but is also in existence right at the root of the Hermetic tradition itself. So the next phase in the pre-Western tradition was that the Arabs eventually invaded Egypt in the early Christian era, and when they got into Egypt, a lot of information that the Greeks had recorded about early Egyptian culture was still in libraries in Egypt, and was still in the possession of priests and people who took it upon themselves to preserve ancient knowledge. So the Arabs got their hands on a lot of this knowledge, and today most of the information that we have about the early Western esoteric tradition comes from Arab translations of very early Greek texts, which were recorded by the Greeks themselves concerning Egyptian concepts: mathematics, philosophy, geometry, astronomy, astrology, and of course things like medicine, magic, and alchemy. So the Arabs recorded this Greek information, and then this situation for the Arabs probably had a lot to do with the Arab culture and the Muslim world before the First Crusade becoming one of the most evolved cultures on the planet, particularly one of the most evolved cultures in the near Middle East and in Europe. The Arabs, as anybody should know who's paid any attention to that period in history, around 700, 800 AD, the Arabs had some of the first universities in the near Western world, the Middle and Near East. They had quite a developed system of mathematics, of geometry, of astronomy, cartography. They had also explored widely. They had a very developed philosophical system, and of course alchemy, metallurgy, and magic and mysticism. All of these things were very well developed around the time of about 700 to 800 AD, when Western Europe was still in the Dark Ages. So we also need to consider how that situation came about. So most people should be aware, who are watching this, that the Romans conquered virtually all of Western Europe and a big chunk of the Near East. And while the Romans ruled most of the known world, they were the centre of all culture and all technology. So things like ceramics, glass making, metallurgy, mathematics, engineering, mechanics, all of those things that we take for granted today, and which also made the world tick back then, made it possible to build roads, move armies across vast distances of culture and lands, build aqueducts and bridges, and all those kind of things, mathematics, philosophy, were all governed by and centered on the Roman Empire. And then when the Roman Empire collapsed, the problem was that because the Romans were so strict about micromanaging and controlling everything, the cultures that they had conquered and who had ruled for all those years suddenly found themselves in a situation where they didn't know how to keep things working properly. And this was the beginning of the Dark Ages, because people couldn't do simple things as well as the Romans could, like build drainage systems, sewage systems, bath houses, construct large buildings, build decent roads, and all those kind of things. The Western world was virtually destroyed. And of course, a big part of the collapse of the Roman Empire was that it was also the Holy Roman Empire. That what was left of literacy, that means reading and writing, and to a certain degree mathematics, philosophy, was basically centered on the church culture, the Holy Roman Empire during the Dark Ages. The church were naturally already educated in these things, so when Europe collapsed into the Dark Ages, monasteries, abbeys and churches were the places where what was left of culture, what was left of learning and education, and basically of intelligence, was centered largely on the clerical community, on the church community, and particularly in monasteries. So we find during the Dark Ages virtually all books and writing and all learning and education was being held onto by the church, which gave them a monopoly, and which was only handed over to the common person or even the aristocracy when the church felt that it was necessary. And of course, one of the things that it is helpful to understand at this time, because the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church inherited their power and their position in Western society from the old Roman Empire, it meant that the core language of Europe in those times in the Dark Ages was Latin, which of course was the native language of Rome. And this is why the Catholic Mass was originally a Latin Mass, and why a lot of old manuscripts on alchemy and on magic were written in Latin, because they were originally written in the only language which was being used for writing things down. People in their local areas still spoke their local languages and dialects, but the moment anything was recorded in writing, it was always written in Latin, because that was a leftover from the old Roman Empire. And therefore, if you weren't educated in Latin, you weren't educated, and you weren't an intelligent individual. So also the nobles, the aristocrats who ruled feudal Dark Age Europe, when it came to contracts and recording knowledge and information, they had to rely on the church for that. And therefore the church had a huge monopoly on knowing what family lineages were and recording that information, keeping track of contracts. They were always involved in making contracts. They always knew where people were making deals with each other. They knew where the money was flowing, and of course they had their fingers in all of that. So there we have the Dark Age Europe. At the same time, in the Near and Middle East, the Muslim Empire was developing, very intelligent, very evolved, and most of Western Europe had no idea about this. And then all of a sudden, in 1095, what was his name? Pope Urban II decided that he was going to sponsor a crusade to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims, in order that the Holy Roman Empire and Catholic Europe, because there was no Protestant religion back then, it was only Catholics. If you were a Christian, and virtually everybody was, you were part of the Catholic Church in the Holy Roman Empire. They wanted to get their hands back on Jerusalem. They wanted to take it off the Muslims. So Pope Urban II in 1095 preached a crusade, and it wasn't until 1099 that that crusade was successful and the Holy Roman Empire seized Jerusalem and took it over. The important thing for us as far as the beginning of the Western Hermetic tradition is concerned is what this situation did was it allowed Europeans for the first time, especially the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese and the Germans, but of course also the British, but mainly the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese and the Germans, and particularly the French, to enter the Near and Middle East on their way to war. And what this did was put them closely in touch with the Middle Eastern culture of the day. And one of the first things that they discovered was that these people that they were trying to seize Jerusalem back from were a very developed and intelligent culture, which kind of surprised them. So of course this was a holy crusade, and that meant that a lot of religious individuals, monks and clerics, accompanied soldiers on their incursions into Muslim territory. Now, one of the curious things about the Catholic Church and about the monastic tradition in particular that isn't understood, and which there's a lot of misunderstanding about, was that originally the monastic tradition, which was kind of the beginning of Christianity, like the first serious Christians way back at the beginning, were largely people living in isolated communes in the Middle East. And these isolated communes also supported like hermitages, where there were individuals or very small groups of men who were totally reclusive and isolated from the general population, usually in the desert. And when Christianity started growing and evolving, and basically the Catholic Church arose, and Constantine eventually made it the official religion of Rome, the church kind of frowned upon the monastic tradition in a way. So the monastic tradition, monks of the Christian church, in a manner, were kind of considered to be rebels, because they kept to themselves. They already had a very old tradition of their old beliefs about what Christianity was, and a lot of that attitude and information didn't gel with what the evolving Catholic Church wanted to turn Christianity into. So there was a little bit of a juxtaposition there between the hardcore authority of the evolving Catholic Church, the Roman religion, and the old monastic tradition. So when monks went into the Middle East with the Crusades, one of the things that happened there was that those guys largely were not opposed to the Muslim religion or to the Muslim way of thinking. And so it was easy for them, because they were kind of the mystics of the Christian religion, and so therefore, you know, saw themselves as being, their ideals and their beliefs as being over and above, you know, Christian politics, if you like. When they went to the Middle East, they were quite happy to mingle with Muslims, and in particular, one of the first things that they did was try and find individuals in Muslim culture who lived and similar lives to them and who had similar attitude. And what this did was it caused a interaction between the Christian monastic tradition and the Muslim mystical tradition, such as Sufism and other similar kinds of things. So the monks largely saw this interaction as a way of learning knowledge that they themselves had been denied since the fall of the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire. Because these guys had been hiding away in monasteries anyway, and copying books, preserving knowledge, studying science, whatever, you know, what they could of it, and a lot of it revolved around Greek knowledge, because the Greeks were the connection between the ancient world, the ancient Egyptians, and the pre-Egyptian ancient cultures that the esoteric tradition talks about, and sort of what was at that time modern Europe. So this whole image of some spoonbills flying there. So this whole image of monks going into the Middle East at around the time of the First Crusade, they were probably doing it before then, but it certainly was happening on a very large scale around the time of the First Crusade, which was 1095 to 1099. It's a very archetypal image in the Western Hermetic tradition, because we recognize that as being the beginning of our tradition. These Christian monks going to the Middle East, interacting with Muslim occultists and mystics, and learning their knowledge from them. A lot of which was Greek knowledge, which the Greeks had learned many centuries earlier from the ancient Egyptians. This whole archetypal interaction situation between the Near East and West was encapsulated in a very famous story which was related in the two documents that were published in the early 1600s called the Farmer and the Confessio of the Rosicrucian fraternity. And in those documents they relate a history of their fraternity, which was a secret society, a secret Rosicrucian society. And in the Farmer and Confessio they talk about the guy who founded their fraternity as being a German monk who travelled to the Middle East and hooked up with occultists in the Middle East, learned special occult knowledge from them and sciences and medicine and stuff like that, and then took it back to Germany, gathered a small number of monks around him in his monastery and passed this knowledge on to them. And because this knowledge was highly controversial in the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, partly because of where it came from, that it came from the infidels, the Muslims, these men formed secret societies in order to preserve and pass on this knowledge. Now, if you want to get a really, really good idea of how that whole situation worked, the Christian Rosencreutz kind of situation and what was happening in the Dark Ages around that time, I strongly recommend watching a movie called The Name of the Rose, which is taken from a book of the same name by a guy called Umberto Eco, very interesting man. And it basically tells a story of a monastery in Europe that had a secret library in it, that where they were hiding a lot of banned literature and copying it and secretly passing it around. Christian Slater and Sean Connery play the lead roles in the movie. Very interesting movie, and it has all the feel of that era, and it basically really does show you what it was like for those monks at that time. Not only that they were hiding all this information, that they had vast secret libraries, but that they were constantly in conflict with the church. So that was the dawn of Western occultism, and this was happening right around 1100 AD, between 1095 and 1100 AD, where this information was being snuck back into Europe, and then secret societies were being formed to preserve that knowledge and disseminate it through Europe and hide it from the church, basically. The next thing that is important to consider in the history of the Western mystery tradition is that a Roman emperor by the name of Diocletian decided, he lived from 244 to 311 AD, and he decided in 296 AD that he was so pissed off with people studying alchemy and seeking how to make gold, and it's considered that he was actually pissed off about the situation because people were succeeding in transmutation and were producing gold, and he was concerned that he didn't have this knowledge and that these alchemists were going to basically destroy the monetary system of the Roman Empire. So what he did was he took it upon himself to gather together all books on the subject of alchemy. In fact, I think he decided basically all books on science and occultism, but particularly on alchemy, that were produced from Egypt in either the Egyptian language or in Greek or Arabic, and he destroyed the lot. He burnt everything. And this was in 296 AD. So because of this, we don't have any surviving records today of what alchemy and magic were like before Emperor Diocletian. All that ancient Egyptian knowledge, all that the details of the ancient Greek knowledge, we know it existed because Diocletian destroyed it, but we really don't know what it talked about. We don't know the details. So there was a severing of the tradition close to 300 AD. What knowledge we do have of that ancient tradition is what was recorded in Greek literature, mathematics, philosophy, geometry and all that, which is why today modern Western culture has claimed that the roots of its culture came from the Greeks, that it was Greek knowledge and science and philosophy which were the foundation of the Western world. But occultists insist that that actually wasn't true, that it was the ancient Egyptian culture, that Greek knowledge that we took from Greek philosophers and scientists and used it to build Western culture was actually taken from the Egyptians. And one of the things about that process of the Greeks taking that knowledge from the Egyptians was that the Egyptians did not want to hand that knowledge over to the Greeks. So the Greeks got only part of the story, and a lot of what they did get was watered down or was tampered with. So a lot of the stuff that the Greeks claimed to either be the source of, or later Western culture claimed the Greeks to have been the source of, is kind of a body of knowledge that was taken from the Egyptians and was in a very bad state of repair. Nevertheless, Diocletian couldn't have destroyed everything, particularly what was in people's heads. And of course, it's very likely that there were also secret societies back then that were preserving this knowledge. So the next thing we see is a Greek guy, I think he was Greek, Zosimos of Panopolis. And he was living in Alexandria in Egypt in 300 AD. And one of his favourite things was chemistry and alchemy. And he produced a whole lot of writings on a whole bunch of subjects, but one of the things he's very famous for is having written an encyclopedia on alchemy and chemistry. And a lot of the information about the subject of alchemy that he recorded in his encyclopedia were quotes from the writings of a woman who we know today as either Mary the Jewess or Mary the Prophetess. And it's guessed by scholars today that she lived around 200 AD. So she was living about 100 years before Zosimos of Panopolis. And he was writing about her and talking about her writings and quoting her writings about 100 years after she lived. So as far as the oldest information that we have about alchemy in the West, Mary the Jewess is one of the oldest sources of reliable information on the subject. And so that means that we can't historically trace our tradition back earlier than her, as far as hard information on what they were thinking, what they were writing about, what they were doing. So Zosimos recorded this information right at the time, or just after Diocletian had destroyed all of that Egyptian knowledge on alchemy and the occult. In fact, Diocletian was still alive for 11 years while Zosimos was recording this information. So it was probably being done in secret, and he might have been doing it as a way of recording what had been destroyed for posterity. So Zosimos's writings are the most direct record of alchemy that survives to the modern time. While he refers to earlier people such as Mary the Jewess, his actual writings are the oldest ones that we have on the subject of alchemy. So let's go back again to, we're at the Crusades, and it's 1100, and that esoteric information is pouring into Europe. It is considered that at that time during the First Crusade, and for some time afterwards, this esoteric knowledge that was being brought back from Muslim Europe was so sensitive and so secret, and they were in such a hurry to hide it, that it took another 100 years before that information sort of came out to the surface, and we start seeing people writing about it, actually recording knowledge. So it wasn't until 1200 AD that most of the earliest writings on the subject of magic and alchemy start appearing in enough volume that that copies of those manuscripts and writings survive through to our own time. Most of what was happening before 1200 AD was happening underground by secret societies and people who were studying and copying and passing on that knowledge in secret. And there mustn't have been very much of it, because hardly anything has survived from that period of time. So, for example, the very first book on alchemy between 1100 and 1200, the very first, we actually know when the very first book on alchemy was translated from Arabic into Latin. And the translation was done by a gentleman who went by the name of Robert of Chester. He was an Englishman. He was an Arabist, which means that a big part of his job, his career, was translating Arab texts into Latin, and possibly into other languages as well. So he was aware that this knowledge was flooding back into Europe from the Middle East because of the Crusades, and he was in Spain in 1144, and he published the first book on alchemy, which he titled The Composition of Alchemy. And that book was published on the 11th of February 1144. There are still copies of that book, and the publishing date is written in the front. So we can actually time down to the day when the very first book on the subject of alchemy was exposed to Western culture. It was through that book that Western intellectuals first became aware of the subject of alchemy on what might be called a popular level, because the chances were before 1144 people knew about it. A lot of those monks that were going to the Middle East had probably heard of the subject, probably seen demonstrations of alchemy done, and had probably discussed it. But it wasn't, Arab texts weren't being translated and didn't become available to the general reading public of Europe until 1144, the 11th of February 1144. And that's something like 820 years ago, 830 years ago, something like that. And that book was called The Composition of Alchemy. And one of the curious things about that book is that it told the story of a Roman monk by the name of Morianus, who went to live in Jerusalem as a hermit, and who taught alchemy to an Arab sheikh, I think he was, at the time. And that book still exists today. It's well known, and you can get copies of it off the internet, the Book of Morianus. So the subject of occultism, magic and alchemy, didn't really start to become well studied and well known until about 1200 AD. And so then we find two individuals of importance popping up around 1250 or 60. And these guys wrote about alchemy in such a way that we know from their writings that they were writing about an extremely well-developed alchemical culture. They didn't just get books and study them and were trying to create an alchemical culture from scratch. When they were writing in the mid-1200s on the subject of alchemy, they were describing a very advanced understanding. So they were obviously part of a long evolved tradition, at least 100 years in Europe before them, and of course a tradition that had been adopted from the Middle East. These two individuals went by the names of Ramon Lull and Arnold de Villanova, and both of the conventional historians today say neither of these guys were alchemists, even though alchemists in the alchemical and the Hermetic tradition insist that they actually were alchemists. The historic figures that went by those names. Conventional science says no, no, no. Those guys were never alchemists. Somebody else stole their name and wrote alchemical manuscripts. So there's a lot of debate now, because this kind of thing goes on a lot, where people who are part of the Hermetic and alchemical tradition say X individual was an alchemist, historically well known, and here are his books on alchemy. And then modern conventional history says no, 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 those people were never alchemists. There's nothing in their history that suggests they were, and possibly sometimes they say there are things in their history that show that they didn't believe in alchemy or that they weren't involved in it. But either way, so there's a tradition has grown up which claims that through history, alchemists who wanted to work in secret were publishing their works under the name of famous people, and they almost at random picked the names of famous people that would be trusted or respected or whatever. So there existed in Spain in the early to mid 1200s a guy called Ramon Lull, and he was a Christian missionary, and his big thing was that he wanted to convert the Muslims to Christianity. So he made a number of trips into the Middle East and got himself in a great deal of trouble, got stoned, and I think eventually got murdered because of his attempts at trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. So he was the Catholic Church have information about this guy in their histories, and one of the things that's claimed about the historic missionary Ramon Lull was that he was not an alchemist, and that he actually said in some of his writings that he didn't believe in alchemy, that he didn't think it was true. But what we do have is a whole body of writings from around the time of the historic Ramon Lull, which were written by somebody who said that he was Ramon Lull. So it was claimed that these books on alchemy were authored by Ramon Lull. So what we do today is we call this guy who authored these books the pseudo Ramon Lull. In other words, a guy who called himself that but wasn't actually Ramon Lull. So we have an enormous body of works written by Ramon Lull, living in Spain 100 years after the First Crusade, and this guy was involved in a very serious way in a well-developed version of the alchemical tradition. Because he was one of the earliest writers on alchemy to have his works widespread in Europe and to have such a big influence on the early development of European alchemy, it is safe to say today that we can talk about the Lullian tradition, or the Lullian school or stream of knowledge. And one of the core themes of Raymond Lull's alchemy was what we today call the acetate path, which back then was called either the path of the vegetable stone or the work of Saturn. Raymond Lull described this path in so much detail that even today, and for the last thousand years, almost, when acetate path alchemists have discussed that process, they do so in such a way that they're still using the language, the codes, ciphers and symbolism that that original pseudo-Raymond Lull laid down in his own writings. Contemporary with Raymond Lull, the pseudo-Raymond Lull, was Arnold de Villanova, and he lived from 1235 to 1311, so he was living at exactly the same time as Lully, and the same things are said about him. He's a well-known historic figure, and somebody wrote books under his name and put his name on them, claiming to be him. And alchemists have always identified those texts with the historic Arnold de Villanova, but modern historians say, nah, they're not the same guy. This historic guy was not involved in alchemy in any kind of way, as if they would know. And of course, when this kind of thing is claimed about historic figures, one of the things that's never taken into consideration was, back in those times, a lot of this information had been preserved and passed around in secret societies. So a lot of the activities associated with studying magic and alchemy had been kept secret. That's why there was no trace of it. And that's one of the reasons why these guys behaved in such a way as to hide their association with these subjects. So it's not impossible that that Lull, the historic Lull and the historic Arnoldus, were actually involved in alchemy, but encouraged people to believe that they weren't. Either way, it doesn't matter. What matters is the writings themselves, the books themselves, and what matters is whether or not those books describe an accurate tradition. And the important thing about Arnoldus and Ramon is that they were both talking about the same system, but in their own way. They had their own kind of language and their own sort of symbolism and their own artful kind of way of describing the acetate path. So we have two very prominent figures at that time discussing exactly the same process and path. And the book that is most associated with Arnoldus de Villanova is called the Rosarium Philosophorum. It was originally just a series of woodcut pictures. Then German text was added to it, and then later on a whole screed of text was added to the German and the woodcuts and made into a whole book on the subject. But the important thing is these two guys living in Spain inherited the acetate path tradition and described it in very deep detail. Now the important thing of this is that I insist, and this is a new idea because we don't hear anybody else talking about this before I started discussing it, that the acetate path tradition was the core tradition of alchemy. It was probably the oldest, the earliest, the longest lasting, the most developed stream of alchemical knowledge. And that other paths, such as the path of the red dragon or the cinnabar path, and the path of the Regulus of antimony and the path of niter, these things were developed and invented a lot later in history. Particularly the path of the red dragon and the path of the Regulus of antimony require strong mineral solvents. And strong mineral solvents weren't discovered until the time of Jabir in Arabic alchemy, before Europeans went anywhere near the Muslim countries and learned of alchemy themselves. But that was around 700 AD. Nobody knew about mineral acids before that time, as far as we know. Even if they did know about it before that time, it certainly didn't go back into pre-Christianity. So whoever was practicing alchemy, for example, in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, they were practicing a system that didn't require the use of strong mineral solvents such as nitric acid, sulfuric acid, aqua regia, hydrochloric acid. They had none of those things. So whatever method they were using required something that was more natural, more easier to obtain, and it was part of a much, much older tradition. My argument is that old tradition was the acetate path, because all the acetate path requires in the way of equipment and knowledge is acetic acid, which we get from vinegar, which is a very ancient liquid beverage, goes back way, way, way back into history, and lead, which also goes way back into history, and something to make retorts out of, or alembics. And the oldest alembic that we know of historically was found in Babylonia in 2000, dated back to 2500 BC. So we can say that there's a good possibility that alchemy was being practiced as far back as 2500 BC. And if it wasn't using strong mineral acids. It was using something else that was easier to for us to get our hands on. And the process for the acetate path could easily be worked with minimal equipment in the middle of the desert when you were part of a camel train living in the Middle East somewhere, if you wanted to do that. And it could have been practiced as far back as 4,500 years ago at least. So that pretty much tells the whole story of the early Western tradition. And it also adds to that story some views that I personally have that you don't hear other people presenting. And that is the importance of the Lullian tradition. That acetate path was the first method of alchemy that was brought into Europe. That Lully and Arnoldus were two of the first guys that we know of who were practicing and teaching that process in Western Europe, and that from their day, the mid-1200s, to our time, that tradition has survived and developed and grown and been practiced by virtually every famous, well-known alchemist through 1,000 years of Western culture. So a lot of the angle that I talk about alchemy from this point on in my podcast, I will be discussing the Lullian tradition quite a bit, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and that's the one I believe everybody should begin by studying. And so in future podcasts we'll be talking about that subject in more detail. Thanks very much for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I think probably the next subject in the third podcast will be a definition of what alchemy is, which is very important, because a lot of people have different understandings about what alchemy is, and there's a lot of wishy-washy stuff. So we need to nail that down so that we know what it is we're talking about when we start using the word alchemy. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next podcast.
We have lived in fear. We have lived in fear, and our fear has betrayed us. We will overcome. We will overcome the apathy that has made us. 'Cause we are not alone. We are not alone in the dark with our demons. We have made mistakes. We have made mistakes.